Thank you, John. Okay, I'll just kind of give you a little bit background and a little context for this study, because this is a study on context, actually. Can you hear me? Okay, is it all right? Okay. I had been doing a lot of work on global women's magazines, which have become a big, they're spreading now. Elle magazine you can buy as a special Singapore edition, and there's Elle Thailand, and there's Elle Malaysia, and there's Vogue for each of these countries too, and images of women for the past few years. And I decided I needed to shift directions a little. And I read a book about 6 months ago called The Geography of Thought, How Asians and Westerners Think Differently and Why. And it was written by Richard Nisbett, who's a cognitive psychologist at the University of Michigan. And he had done a lot of studies on eye tracking and how Chinese students saw things versus how American students saw it. And I thought the whole book was fascinating. I recommend you read it. It's a quick sort of, he writes it like, what is it, Malcolm Gladwell's books, Touch Points and whatever. Yep. Anyway, it's easy to read, but it's fascinating. And I want to apply it a little bit, some of the things he talks about, to advertising. All right, so I'm going to kind of run through, and I needed to give you a little background first. So I think most of you know that ads historically have gone from long copy, right, with small visuals, to over time, larger pictures and fewer words. And so even in the 60s, you started to see more poster ads with just a headline and a visual. And today, the picture tells the story, so that ads are predominantly visual. Bill Ryan, who wrote a book on graphic communication, says that the fact is we're visually predisposed, and photography carries the weight and power of most communication in everything from websites to magazines, identity material to advertising. So what I'm interested in is, most of the books that have been written by graphic communication and even our textbooks on advertising are often based on research that was done in the United States with Westerners. And I wondered if some of these theories on graphic design and how to present your message might really be very culture-based. So since advertising is becoming more and more visual and also more global, I wanted to see how culture shaped audiences' perception of advertising visuals. Now, I'm not going to spend a lot of time, because actually, if I time this, I think I could quickly talk for 30 minutes, and I want to give you some time to ask questions. So I will just quickly tell you that there's been many strains of literature that relate to this study. Going back to Edward Hall's book on Beyond Culture, where he talks about high and low context cultures and how Asian cultures tend to be much more context-oriented. People need to understand and read context, whereas Americans were very direct. We like to get to the point, right? Then there's the cultural studies literature, the British cultural studies literature, where there's a lot of, people have studied advertising from a semiotic perspective and underlying how symbols are used and create ideology. And then there's the marketing literature, which I'll touch on quickly. And also there's the graphic design literature too. All of these things in some way relate back to this. But recently, the cognitive psychologists have begun to scientifically study the way culture shapes how people process information and thus see the world. Nisbett notes differences in Eastern and Western approaches to learning, medicine, communication, and such. He has a really interesting example in his book that I think, I don't know when you learned to read, but when I learned to read, we had a reader in first grade, and it said, see Dick, see Dick run. And then you turn the page and it says, see Jane run. And then there was a see Spot run. Is that what you does that ring a chord? Yeah, you had a reader like that too. Well, it's kind of interesting. We just take these things for granted, but actually, what is the context for Dick? We don't know, do we? I mean, we see Dick, but we don't know anything about Dick. Who is Dick, right? Who is Spot? Does Spot belong to Dick? There's no relationship between any of these characters in the book we're reading about. There is, in fact, no context. So what Nisbett found was that when he asked his Chinese students what their first grade reader was like, they remembered a story that said, it had a picture of the older brother and the little brother, and it said, see big brother. And then he picked him up and he put the little brother on his shoulders and says, see big brother, help little brother. So just in this simple process of learning to read, the Chinese were learning more context and relationships, whereas we were learning how to see the object without the context. The other thing that he talks about is that this kind of permeates a lot of things in Asia versus the West. I mean, even simple things like, Western medicine and Chinese medicine. When I first started to live in Malaysia, I remember I had a sore throat. So I went to the doctor and I said, I have a sore throat. Can you give me some throat medicine? And the doctor said, you need to stop drinking cold things with ice and not sleep with the air conditioner on. So I thought, whoa, I don't know where this person got their medical degree, but I need another doctor. So I went to the next doctor and I said, I have a throat problem. Could I have throat medicine? And they told me the same thing. So then I started to realize that maybe in the tropics you really shouldn't be drinking cold drinks. Well, that didn't make sense from my perspective, but the way Chinese medicine is it doesn't necessarily treat the organ. What I'm trying to say is, like Western medicine, if you have something wrong with you, they treat that organ, right? Because you take the organ out of the context of the whole person and you treat the organ. Whereas in Asian medicine, Ayurvedic medicine or Chinese medicine, you treat the whole person. And that's the way to go out. So there are different philosophies behind a lot of the way that people learn and experience the world. And again, I'm going to move it to visual images soon. To talk a little bit about global advertising. Global advertising, there has been a debate, which many of you may be aware of, that what works better from an advertiser's perspective? A global campaign that you can kind of run everywhere in the world and maybe just translate a few headlines, or a campaign where you use local people and you show local people doing localized things and using the product in a local context, right? So in the 60s, everything was global campaigns, and then the 70s it kind of went back and became more localized, and then the 80s they became global campaigns again, and then so it's been shifting back and forth in the advertising industry. Advertisers, starting in the 1960s, where Arthur Fatt said there's a growing school of thought that different people are all basically the same, and that an international advertising campaign with a truly universal appeal can be effective in any market. So this kind of theory has actually been behind a lot of global campaigns. So I'm loving it as a global campaign, right? You can go to a McDonald's in Kuala Lumpur or Singapore or Bangkok, and they'll all have on the black shirt with the I'm loving it. And on TV, they'll be using the same song, and people will be breakdancing, and everybody's it's kind of funny because you go in and they're grumpy, and they don't look like they're loving it, but nonetheless, I'm loving it. So this is a global campaign. From the advertiser's perspective, global campaigns are great. You conceive of them in New York or London, right? You just run them all over the world with minor translation, one production cost, right? You don't have to hire local advertising agencies to do any creative work. And you have a consistent brand image across cultures. So let me just show you a few examples of what global print campaigns look like in women's magazines, because, as I mentioned, here's a De Beers ad that runs in Vogue New York, right? Here's the same De Beers ad that would run in the Chinese edition of Vogue magazine. I think we can do these two too. I think this is a Chanel. So in other words, here's the Chanel in English, the exact same one in Chinese, right? So that in fact, all they have to do is shoot this layout, New York, right? Send it to the office in China, someone translates, they run it in the Elle magazine in China. And that's a global ad, or a standardized ad. So Vogue New York, the same one, Vogue Germany. See? You just translate the headline, you run the same ad in Vogue in Germany, or Elle. So what Nisbett's saying, and he never talks about advertising, his book has nothing to do with advertising. But what he said is that people see the world differently. So he was using these eye-tracking cameras to study how American students and Chinese students looked at visual images. So here's a picture, and I want to ask you, what do you see? I'm going to pick one of you. Okay.
What are those? What are they swimming in? Coral. Is it coral?
Yeah. Okay. The majority of people, when you ask them, what do you see, say they see two fish. if you ask Americans. All right? However, interestingly enough, when he asked Japanese and American students what they see, most of them recalled seeing the focal fish in the foreground and background objects such as plants, rocks, and bubbles. The Japanese made reference to the background elements. In other words, they would often start out and say, that was an underwater picture. In the underwater picture, in other words, they established the context rather than just identifying the focal objects. All right? They also asked 25 Americans of European descent and 27 native Chinese to view a series of pictures while they recorded the participants' eyes and what they focused on. The Americans looked more at the foreground object while the Chinese spent more time studying the background and taking in the whole picture. In fact, I think it was the Chinese eyes were like 70% more moving around the picture. In the split second after each participant first sees the picture, the Americans looked at the focal object in the picture 20% longer than the Chinese, and their eyes darted around much less than the Chinese. So there are, in fact, cultural differences. In fact, Nisbett was able to say that Westerners pay more attention to the focal object in the photograph than the Asians. So how does that affect advertising and what you know? Some of you are advertising students, right? How does that relate to what you've learned about advertising? Anybody want to just throw out an idea? Yes. A hand. Thank you so much.
Well, it's like it'll affect how people, like wherever the market is, they'll try to advertising companies will try to suit it for that. Like in American markets, it'll be more. They'll have more objects for us to focus on, like specifically, instead of like the entire context.
Okay, that's a good point. Okay, so if I wanted to reach you as an American consumer, right, I would create an ad where the product was the focal object, correct?
Right.
Because that's the way you perceive the world, right? But would that, in fact, work globally?
Not necessarily.
Not necessarily, right? And in the books that you learn about advertising, the theories that you're learning, I shouldn't just ask you, I know he's feeling like, why should you keep looking at me? The theories that you're learning are based on ideas such as, make the product the hero, right? Put the product as this focal object, right? Those kinds of theories, often based, I think, on how Westerners perceive advertising. So, in fact, Asians attend more broadly to the overall surroundings and the relation between the object and the field. He said Asians see the world through a wide-angle lens, whereas Westerners have more tunnel vision and pay more attention. Here's another part that's really interesting. I hope I don't do too much. Okay. When they did this study with the Chinese students and the American students, and this is another cognitive psychologist test, they showed these words on backgrounds. So let's imagine that you have 10, I'm going to show you 10 cards, and each card is going to have a different word on it, right? 5 of the cards will have people as the background, and 5 of the cards will just have the word with a white background. You understand? Then I'm going to ask you afterwards what words do you remember from this test, okay? When they did that, they found that Chinese participants could recall more words presented on social backgrounds than their American counterparts. Pictures of people served as retrieval cue for the words, indicating that the Chinese were paying more attention to the social cues. The Americans could remember the words that were on the white cards better. Okay, so now, another student I'm going to... What does that say about things you've learned about how to present information in terms of a layout on an ad? What do you learn? Where should you put the words? How should you present them? What do you think?
A lot of times you get told to do it more directly, like the way the Americans would perceive it.
Right, so that in fact, putting it against white space is better, more legible, easier to remember. You don't want to put it against a lot of background that would be busy, right? These are all kinds of concepts that I think we learn or at least I find them throughout the textbooks. Okay, I'm not going to go in too much into the reasons that Asians and Westerners think differently. That in itself could take a lot of time, but basically these kinds of societies are often more contextual. In other words, we learn in the States growing up to be very direct, to get our message across quickly. We want to get jobs done, right? Most Asian cultures, there's a lot more subtlety to the communication. I mean, you have to learn body language. People will often in Asia say, in fact, some of the languages don't even have the word no. So that in order to understand that the answer is no, you have to somehow intuit, because people aren't direct like that. So there's many, many things that I could go into about the differences and why people think slightly differently. But I want to get to the basic study. Okay, design textbooks often do this. They often tell us that the way that a consumer will enter the ad is that they'll start up on the upper left-hand side, they'll go across, down, and then they'll end on the lower right-hand side, which is where you want to put the logo, right? Because that's how people are leaving the layout, right? Okay, we assume that this is universal, yes? So, I mean, you look at a lot of ads and you can see how the art director designed them, assuming that that was how we were going to look at this ad. But does everyone really look at the ad that way? In fact, now we're finding out probably not. So what I wanted to do was just do a very simple qualitative study and take the picture out of ads and just put it on a piece of paper with some lines and give it to people in 3 different countries and ask them what they saw in that picture, just to kind of understand what people were taking away from the visual. So we wanted to test whether Nisbett's findings might apply to how people saw the visual component of ads. So the research question is, when examining the visual component of an advertisement, will Westerners tend to focus on the foreground object, while Asians tend to focus on the background objects? And when examining the visual component of an advertisement, will Asians look for connections or relationships between the objects and people more often than Westerners? So here was the experiment. We just photocopied these pictures, put them on the blank pieces of paper with some lines, and sent them to a faculty member that we knew in India, the US, and Singapore, where we did it. And because English is the language of instruction in all 3 countries, it was easy to code these, and to analyze them. And part of the students were Asian and some, the US were Western, so we thought this was an easy thing. Now, we wanted to first start out with a control photo, because remember, Nisbett used 2 fish, right? So we wanted to make sure that we could really replicate what he was doing. In fact, people really did see things the way he said. So we just used a turtle, right? So the turtle is essentially the foreground object and underwater, right? Okay. Nisbett used the fish, right? Then we took 2 ad photos, and we just took the visual component of these, and these are global ads. So what I'm saying is that the advertisers are running these all over the world. We used a 4-year-old issue of Elle magazine Singapore, because if it was old, maybe we thought they wouldn't recognize it specifically as an ad, because we were just using the photo. So one photo was from a Calvin Klein perfume ad for Eternity, and another was for a woman's handbag. So let me show you how this works. It takes a couple of seconds to come up. You recognize that ad? Maybe saw it a few years back. Okay, so what we did is we just took this photo out of this ad, and this is all we asked the students to look at and ask them what they saw. So you might want to look at it for a few seconds. Okay, the second one was a handbag ad. So there's the ad. We just retouched this out. So then they just looked at the photo. And again, write down what you see. Okay? So we sent this to the different countries, and the instructions were just, this is a survey. It will only take you about 10 minutes. Just fill in the demographic information at the top, and then write what you see in the picture. The instructor will tell you when 3 minutes is up, and you're just to turn the page and to write what you see on the next page. There's no right and wrong way to do this survey. You can list things, or you can write a narrative. So in analyzing the responses, we were kind of interested to see which objects people first noted and what kind of relationships they showed. Now, very interesting. When I showed the turtle photograph to the Americans, the first thing they wrote down was that they saw a turtle. 96% of them saw a turtle. Interestingly enough, in India, that was not the first thing. Half of the students said that what they saw was an underwater scene, right? So there was a difference in the way they described that. Also, the way in which Indians talked about what they saw was really interesting. They talked about the sea being beautiful, that the turtle was languishing or swimming, that it might be feeling lonely, right? That it was isolated from other creatures. Some of them said it was surrounded by enemies, you know. There was a lot of connection between the foreground and the background. They used a lot of phrases like it's floating over the corals or it's caught in the seagrass. In other words, they created a story about this turtle. It wasn't like, I see a turtle underwater. The turtle had feelings, emotions, you know, had relationships with the little fish that were in the background. I asked my Indian students in Singapore, what do you think? Why is it like this? And they said, well, we're a very sort of storytelling culture. We have the Ramayana and, you know, epics like that. The kids grow up with these big stories, so maybe that's why the Indians are describing it more as a story when they're asked what they see. The Singaporeans were very analytic. 50% of them chose to just list what they saw rather than write a story. Most of them described it as a sea turtle, which was interesting because sea is the context word, so I was not sure about that. When the Singaporeans looked, they wrote down colors, they emphasized shapes and patterns and sizes, things like the scales are brown with little white spots on them, which was really very detailed. And sometimes they used abstract concepts like the turtle is free and this and that. The US respondents were very succinct in describing what they saw. Most Americans began with the words I see. All but one saw the turtle first. The details were things like colors. And it was generally very limited to, I see a turtle with white coral and blue sea. And that's basically what most of them said they saw. Okay, now this one's interesting. Here's this next photo from the Eternity Cologne. I should ask you what you see. What do you see? That's interesting. What do you see? Okay, I'm going to ask one of these guys. What do you see?
I don't know. It's a good time going on. I don't really know.
Good time going on?
Thought of a family playing with a family pet.
Okay.
Some people having fun with, it looks like an animal or rabbit.
Okay, so three different answers. Yeah, so we don't all see the world the same way. All right. So the animal is a...
I thought it looks like a rabbit.
You know, you wonder if the advertisers just assumed everyone knew that was a rabbit, right? But oddly enough, not everybody saw it was a rabbit. Okay, interestingly enough, 85% of the people that we showed it to in India said that is a family, and especially a happy family. Only 26% of the Americans wrote down that they saw a family. Sorry, most of them saw 3 people. Yeah? Okay. And interestingly enough, the Singaporeans and the Americans were closer in describing what they saw. So the Indians tended to see a happy family. They used words like, oh, they always said this is a happy family, a father, a mother, and a child. Even though the father's in the background. Do you know what I mean? So they weren't, in other words, a family always starts with the father. All but one said that it was a dog. Right? And they said that the family was on holiday, they were relaxing, they were fond of the dog, they loved each other. And a few of them said it was an ad for birth control because there's a slogan used in India, a small family is a happy family. And a number of them said that that's what they thought might be. It might be a picture from an ad. Okay, right. The Singaporeans. The majority of the Singaporeans said they saw 3 people or 2 females and a male. Less than a third called this a family. And I really thought, you know, they're Asian, they'll see the whole thing as a family. Some said they saw the man and the woman, and the Singaporeans, you know, they analyze all these details. They're too young to have a daughter at that age. Or the woman is too gorgeous to have had a child already. A few thought it was a brother, you know, and two sisters. Only one used the word like love, whereas the Indians used that word a lot. Color was important. They all talked about it being a black and white photograph. Half of them thought it was a dog. The other half thought it was a rabbit. And interestingly enough, I didn't even know that this was a famous model when I picked that ad. I just picked a photograph, you know. 3 Singaporeans said that was Christy Turlington. They knew the name of the model. And they also, one of them said she also advertises Maybelline products. So they were so able to identify the details of that, which, you know, it's a very commercialized culture, Singapore. And I think that that's possibly part of it. So one respondent correctly identified it as being a Calvin Klein ad. The Americans. Most respondents described the photo as showing 3 people or 3 models, or in one case, 3 white people. A few said it was 2 sisters and a brother. The majority correctly identified the animal as a rabbit. American respondents did not use many adjectives. They tended to say things like, it's a male, a female, and a girl with a bunny. They're all lying on the bed. They're wearing white clothes. You know, it's not a great narrative. It's just, this is what I see. A few noted that they didn't look old enough to have a child, and some suggested sexual things, like the boy is thinking, get your sister out of here so we can have some fun time. Only one respondent correctly identified the photo as being from a Calvin Klein ad. Okay, now this one's interesting. I chose this ad, really, you know, not thinking too much, but thinking this is a foreground object. You know, maybe if I show it, the Americans will all talk about the red bag, and maybe the Asians will talk about the room or something like that. But, you know, look at the picture for a couple of seconds before I move on. Okay, so what did you see? What did you see, John?
Well, what I saw was actually 2. Was it an elbow? It was like a bee, and then there was another bee in the right-hand side of the picture.
Okay, you were looking at the background. What's happening in the background? Okay, all right. Anybody else? Oh yeah, thank you. What?
I saw the long hair, just the long hair hanging over the bed.
Of the girl.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Yeah.
I saw a girl on a bed and her arms up,
Yeah.
pointing to her head.
Okay. All right. Anybody else see anything? Okay, I'm just going to go back real fast. Oh my gosh, I don't even know if I can figure out how to go back. Let's try it again. Okay, whatever I'm going to talk about next, I didn't even see when I did this, but there are. Okay, Indians. The majority of them noted the woman on the bed as the central focus. Only 4 actually even mentioned the red bag, and I did show them the ad in color. They told the story of this woman who'd been out shopping for her family. She was doing her duty for her family. She was tired after doing, you know, her duty. It was very interesting. You know, they were all sort of feeling sorry for her because she had been, you know, working so hard doing the shopping. A few said she might be posing for a painter. Some said she was dreaming of owning the bag in the front. The Singaporeans, what happened to the Singaporeans here? Okay. The Singaporeans saw a woman lying horizontally on a sofa bed in a messy room. They talked a lot about her clothing. You know, they're really interested in the details. She had a polka dot skirt. Now, this was really interesting. Until I read the Singaporeans thing, I didn't even know there were faces in the background. Did any of you see those faces in the background? Okay, I'm going to go back and show it to you then. A surprising number of them actually talked about these faces that were in the background. And a few saw sexual innuendo, you know, the way she was holding her, tugging at her dress. Okay, so let me quick go back. Oh, dear. Right, forward, right? Now look at it. Interesting, right? No one in India noticed it. Only one American noticed it. But the Singaporeans, a lot of them talked about these faces. So in other words, you see what I'm saying? Like, they have a very analytic way of looking at things. Okay. Sorry. I'll try to do it quickly. All right, Americans. The Americans generally listed exactly what they saw. I see a woman lying on a bed in a trashy house. There's a red shopping bag on the floor in front of her. The Americans almost never described the room, the sheets, the background faces on the wall, or the pattern on a model's dress. And there were a number of, again, the sexual responses like she's waiting for more. Okay, in conclusion. All right, in support of Nisbett's theories, we found that Asians did look for connections or relationships between objects and people more than Americans. The Americans tended to describe the objects as they saw them, but with little context. But again, it was not an East-West divide. Singaporeans and Americans actually were similar in the way they described and analyzed the pictures. Both noted things like age and race of models more than the Indians. The Indian respondents were more interested in creating this narrative, how the characters and the visual felt. So, in other words, it seems to me that you could create a kind of a model here where the US tends to describe objects, right, in an analytic way, but the Singaporeans describe the entire picture, you know. So they look at the context, but they analyze the context. Whereas the Indians tended to be more context-oriented, but they looked at the picture as something to inspire them to tell a story. So it might be interesting to try to do this on a larger scale with other cultures and sort of see where cultures actually fall in this kind of a model. Now I want to just quickly go into one other thing that I think is kind of interesting. In terms of, you know, it was such a simple little study, and we just had these three little demographics like age, gender, and nationality, just in case I mixed up the pages when I was, you know, I wanted to know which ones were from the US and which ones were from India. Now, every student across cultures was able to fill in his or her age and gender. That was not a problem. For nationality, all the Indians wrote Indian, and in Singapore, all but one or two wrote Singaporean. A couple of them instead wrote Chinese, because that's the predominant group out there. However, in America, only 20 of the 26 respondents, only 12 wrote American. 4 wrote Caucasian, 3 wrote white. This is for nationality now. 1 wrote black, 1 wrote African American, 1 wrote Asian, and 4 left it blank. I cannot explain that very well. And maybe you can help me. Because all 3 of these countries are actually, you know, multiracial, multi-ethnic kinds of places. And so I really was interested at how the Americans described themselves. And the Americans were the only ones who described people in the visuals in terms of race, such as I see 3 white people. So thus, racial identity may shape visual perception in some countries more than others, you know. Okay, what are the implications for advertisers? Well, theories on how advertising works are definitely culture-bound. To engage audiences in the US, advertisers probably are doing all the right things. I mean, they know that if you're selling a bottle of water, you put the water there with the person and have the person drink the water, and that'll make sense because this is the hero and this is what you want to see. It might make much more sense in India and other countries to show more people and more social context for it. In fact, I read a story in China that they can't sell detergent there by having the woman stand up and say, "Get your clothes whiter than white," or, you know, see how the stain is removed. That didn't work as well as when they showed a mom teaching her daughter how to do the laundry. That was like a great commercial that everyone loved because, you know, there was sort of more of a relationship and people were showing things together. So concepts like making the product a hero or giving the product a unique selling point are useful for American audiences, but maybe for consumers in other cultures, more storytelling or inspirational cultures, photos suggesting romantic themes of love or drama or human interaction would prove to be much more captivating to an audience. A few limitations of the study. This was just a small experiment. You know, ideally it would be nice to do other cultures. There may be clusters or groups of countries that share a similar way of seeing visuals. You know, just because people share a same language doesn't necessarily mean they see things the same way. I'm married to an Englishman, and I'm always amazed at we can have the same experience on a trip, but when he tells the story of what happened on the trip, I mean, you know, he exaggerates some aspects of it and, you know, embellishes others where, I mean, I would just tell the story, you know. So even with the same language, we often have, we'd fit in different places on that. In other words, the English may come into a higher, they're more context-oriented, And actually, it might even be the way the news is presented. I know, like in the BBC News, there's much more analysis of the context of the event, whereas maybe our news is more, these are the facts and this is what happened. So, this kind of a thing may have a larger effects on how we see things. Okay, and so that's the second. And it may not be an East-West divide because levels of development and exposure to global media influence how audience process visuals. Because the Singaporeans were often closer to the Americans than they were to the Indians, even though both are Asian cultures. Thank you.